Welcome to episode 453 of the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I'm Ashley Scott Meyers, screenwriter and blogger at sellingyourscreenplay.com. Today I am interviewing writer-director David Willing, who just did a low-budget horror film called Surrogate, which we talk about, but we also talk about his career. He started out doing a bunch of short films, and then we talk right up through as how he's now doing feature films. So stay tuned for that interview. If you find this episode valuable, please help me out by giving me a review in iTunes or leave me a comment on YouTube or retweeting the podcast on Twitter or liking or sharing it on Facebook. These social media shares really do help spread word about the podcast, so they're very much appreciated. Any websites or links that I mention in the podcast can be found on my blog and the show notes. I also publish a transcript with every episode in case you'd rather read the show or look at something later on. You can find all the podcast show notes at www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/podcast, and then just look for episode number 453. If you want my free guide, How to Sell a Screenplay in 5 Weeks, you can pick that up by going to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. It's completely free. You just put in your email address and I'll send you a new lesson once per week for 5 weeks along with a bunch of bonus lessons. I teach the whole process of how to sell your screenplay in that guide. I'll teach you how to write a professional logline and query letter and how to find agents, managers, and producers who are looking for material. Really is everything you need to know to sell your screenplay. Just go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. So now let's get into the main segment. Today I am interviewing writer-director David Willing. Here is the interview. Welcome, David, to the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I really appreciate you coming on the show with me today.
Thank you very much for having me, Ashley. We're looking forward to it.
So to start out, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up and how did you get interested in the entertainment business?
So I grew up in Melbourne, Australia, and I really fell in love with cinema at a very young age. I remember a film called Beau Geste that I watched when I was 5 years old on black and white film on television on a Saturday afternoon. And since then, I've just had a deep love for cinema. And when I got into early high school, I started doing some Super 8 films and had a media class at school. And I actually started out wanting to do horror makeup effects. After watching Nightmare on Elm Street, I sort of wanted to do Freddy Krueger makeup. And then when I started to discover, using a camera and then lighting, and then eventually got into writing and directing and went to film school after that. And since then I've just sort of been working away in various parts of the industry, predominantly as a writer director.
Mm-hmm. So talk about some of those first steps. So you went to film school, and then what were those first steps out of film school to actually, breaking into the industry? What were some of those first jobs that you had, and how did you get them? I'm always curious to hear kind of how were you able to land those first couple jobs?
Yeah, it's interesting. I always come from different places. I think the first commercial I did was for a friend who was working at a crisis helpline, and they wanted just a community-based commercial for a fundraiser. So, I remember the first time I was actually in a pub when it came on the TV, and there is that buzz the very first time you see something you've made.
Mm-hmm.
Come up on the TV is always a little bit of a thrill, and then after that, some short films that are predominantly the stuff that I instigated. So whoever I was working with at the time, I'd go this. So I made a short film called Collier Brothers when I was just out of film school, and that one was we just wanted to make the film on that subject matter. So we raised the finance and essentially put the project together ourselves. And then from a writing perspective, I mean, in Australia, there's not really a lot of writing for hire kind of work in the industry. You've just got to, it's a lot of spec writing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I predominantly, spent my time writing. Those some short films and into feature films. And I mean, Surrogate is my first feature film, and we've made this, it's very independently financed and approached as a film. So we have a sort of a two-tier system in Australia. So we have the government funding agencies at a state and federal level, or otherwise projects are made independent of those, and Surrogate was made independent
Gotcha.
of that.
So now talk a little bit about this idea of the state and then federal, grant money for the arts and film. That's totally alien as an American. We don't really have a system like that, but I do talk to Europeans that have had the system. And my impression of it is the people that get the money and are sort of on the in and receiving the money from these institutions, they think it's the greatest system ever invented. And the people that are not on the inside and are trying to fight their way in think it's the most corrupt, evil system ever invented. So where do you kind of land on this? Have you applied for some of these grants? How do you feel it's working? Is it very political? Are they actually giving the best filmmakers, or is it more about who you know? Just how does one sort of navigate that system?
Yeah, it is an interesting one. Predominantly I'm in our industry, aspects of it just wouldn't exist. And same with Europe. I'm in America. You've got, got such a big market and such a viable industry. So here there's just certain parts of the arts that wouldn't exist because it's not the audience base to drive that revenue. So I've had Beth, who I wrote Surrogate with, we actually met. So we're in the state of Victoria, and so there's the film financing body there funded both of us to write drafts of screenplays. So we had to write our initial draft and we submitted that. And lots of people submit them, and then you get, 4 of us got selected to get development funding for the next draft. So that's the only time I've had finance from them. And the thing is it's ultra competitive. Like anything, there's a lot of people and not a lot of funds or a lot of places or spots available to get that funding. And with Surrogate, we decided not to go down that route because what I said to Beth is, because we've had other screenplays in development, I said, let's get something made. As getting a feature film made is really tough. And we just felt that by going through the funding body things, one of the downside is it just takes a lot of time. Films in general will take time, but I sort of went, if we go down that path, we go down there, this is going to turn into a 7 to 10 year process, which is about the average time to develop that project. And I really wanted to do one, inside. We've been on it 6 years now, but the film was finished November last year. So it was just a bit more of an efficient way to go about it. But you obviously don't have access to as much money.
Yeah, that's the downside.
That's the difference. But it got made. We might still be here in meetings, trying to get it financed. So that was just really a practical decision. We just don't want another project in development that doesn't happen.
Gotcha. So I think there's a good segue. Let's dig into Surrogate. Maybe to start out, you can give us a quick pitch or log line. What is the log line for this film?
The log line, so it's a ghost horror about Natalie Paxton, who is a single mother and a nurse, and she gets rushed to hospital with this really weird medical condition that happens to her, medical malaise, and suddenly all these bizarre things start happening to her and her daughter, and she has to fight to stop from her family being destroyed.
So now I notice you've co-written this. You were the director and co-writer with Beth King. Where did this idea come from? Was it a script that you got from Beth and then you tweaked it? Did you guys work on this original? But just talk about the genesis. How did this idea come about? And then what was sort of the initial stages of writing it with Beth, or did she find you after she had the idea?
So Beth and I met as part of script development on other separate projects, and that was probably about 10 years ago. And so the project came about. I approached her. We were having dinner one night. I said, "Hey, let's just write a horror, and let's get it made." And so what we did is we met 2 or 3 times a week for about 2 months. And we would just meet for 4 or 5 hours, and we were brainstorming ideas. So Surrogate came out of a brainstorming session. We didn't know what idea we were going to go with. And so across a few months, we came up with about 6 or 7 different ideas for films. They're mostly horror, though we're interested in crime as well. And Surrogate, it just came to the fore of the one that we thought had the most potential. It was very rudimentary at the start. We really just had this idea about this mother and daughter and a paranormal story.
Now, as you guys are coming up, it sounds like you have 6 or 7 story ideas that you're liking, and you just said this one seemed to have the most potential. Just talk about that. How were you grading these ideas, and why did you think this one had the most potential?
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting question. Because I mean, some of it with the other ideas, we spent a little bit of time developing, and we just realized there wouldn't be enough. There's not enough meat in the idea to get a horror film or a feature film out of that. Some of them we were like, oh, that would make a good short, or the idea just sort of ran out of
Mm-hmm.
steam. And where with Surrogate, is when we hit onto the hook of the story, that's what started to get us really excited. And it's difficult to get into that without spoiling it, so I don't want to sound too cryptic. But
Mm-hmm.
it was Beth. We're talking in this meeting about, near us there's this mountain range, or it's about 2 hours out of our city, and she would tell us that as a child, when she was driving through this range with her auntie would say, there's a ghost hitchhiker here, and when you drive along it gets in the car, and then her auntie would clandestinely turn the air conditioning on and the temperature would drop. And we think that's where we came up with this idea about, what happens when you've got the ghosts that can drift in and out of your life. They attach, and it was really again, it's a bit hard to get without going into detail on the story stuff, but as the sort of story started to develop around what was happening to this mother and why, and how her daughter was now in danger, as we were sort of building on those character ideas and the story events. And there's a little bit of a thriller crime story in there. I mean, when you have a look at any ghost horror, there is sort of a lay detective story going on.
Mm-hmm.
And as we developed like what's happened in the past and started connecting those dots in the story, that was, we just felt that there was a lot to work with. That this there was a lot of potential from from a story and a cinematic point of view.
Gotcha. Now, how much did just like practical business decisions come into this? I mean, just, the sort of the general consensus that we hear are like horror thriller, low budget horror thriller action, are a lot easy to sell than rom-coms or dramas. How much did that affect you? Are you just more interested in these genre films by nature, or was this a consideration as you were going through your ideas?
I was just generally interested in horror. As I said, we're both really big fans of horror films. So Beth and I just used to go along and watch a lot of horror films prior to that. In terms of not so much a marker, but a few things that I laid out at the start of the project was that it had to be something within a reasonable budget range. So the other thing that appealed to us about the idea of Surrogate, initially a lot of it was set in one house, and over time the story expanded out. But so I think minimal locations, minimal cast. But also said to Beth, it's whatever idea we're writing, the script needs to be 85 to 100, or it's 85 to 90 pages. So it was really about, I knew approaching it would be like, let's get as much time and focus and money on a smaller part of the story rather than blowing it out. And also I'm a believer, I teach some filmmaking and screenwriting courses, that it's, a 90-minute film, or as a screenwriter, a 90-minute screenplay is got 25% less opportunities to be weak than a 2-hour screenplay. So it's very demanding, as to write a screenplay. So I was like, let's keep it contained. So the decisions were really about how we write a contained story, and it did expand a little bit over time. But some of that is more production tricks. It looks like we're shooting at a lot more locations than we ultimately did. And then the other bit was that from an audience point of view, I know that, horror plays really well internationally. Horror from Australia, does quite well in Europe and America and Asia as well. So it's really about then pitching at a very, very passionate and dedicated audience, the horror group.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about the actual writing of this. So you and Beth are working on these ideas. Eventually you settle on this idea. What does your collaboration look like? Are you guys in the same room? One of you's at the keyboard, one of you's yelling at the other one. Are you in different rooms on Zoom meetings? Just describe your actual collaboration. How are you cranking out script pages on this?
Yeah, so we, so when it was the brainstorming stuff, it's us in a room just throwing around ideas. back and forth. And what we like to do is keep it really open at the start. And, it's that whole thing, like when I rehearse with actors, it's like, first time to throw it out there and play around with it. So we don't want to be saying no to too many things. But then as we go on, we start to kind of go, what's a good idea or what's not. And part of that is judgment and taste. And Beth and I are open with each other. If something's not a good idea, we'll say, it'll hit at that point, that's not working, or that's not good. And then then we had sort of whiteboards and index cards. So we focus a lot, like Beth is very character focused. So it was really about developing the character, but also the story. We're like, the actual script pages are if you've got a good story, that's the quicker part to write. So we spent months just plotting out what the stories and the characters were. So we would do that together in a room for a session, then we'd go away and write some notes and then send them, then we'd get back together. Then once we really had the story nutted out, we wrote it's about a 7 to 10 page sort of outline treatment of that idea. And then we tweaked it a bit. And then Beth wrote the first full pass of the draft, and she writes quickly once she's in the project. So she spit out a draft pretty quickly, and then I read that, and then I did an edit of that draft and then rewrote scenes, and then we got together and discussed it, and then she would do rewrites of my scenes. So ultimately everything in the film, like I know the bits whose idea it was, but every scene has been written by both of us at a point. So whether it's doing a dialogue rewrite, a scene structure, for an example, there's a really long seance type scene in the film, and Beth's initial pass at that was about 3.5 pages, and I really, from a director point of view, saw the potential of this scene, and it was one of the ones where it's always about how do we tighten it up. It was like, I think we can really expand this scene. So I took that and stretched it to a 7-minute scene. So yeah, it's that back and forward between editing each other's stuff and talking about it. And as well, because I come from a very visual, from a director point of view, and Beth comes from very much a character point of view. So we really get that. This is how it's working emotionally, character, and here's the story, and we'll combine those two together.
And what does your development process look like? So you guys eventually had a draft that you both liked. Do you have some other writer friends, producer friends, actor friends that you then send it out and get notes? How do you sort of develop and get it ready, especially something like this where it sounded like you sort of knew you guys were going to try and fund it, raise the money and shoot it yourself. So your development process is your own. What does that look like on this?
So yeah, we had, I think it was by about the third draft, I never show my first 1 or 2 drafts to anyone outside of either, who I'm writing it with. But the third draft we gave to a couple of writing colleagues to read. And 2 of those were actually writers we'd met at the same development workshop several years earlier. So all 4 of us still meet and read each other's work. And I find that really helpful. So we gave it to them, and they gave us a couple of notes and some perspective on it, which was really helpful. Then we wrote another draft based on that. And what I found also interesting is it's the discussions around the script that came, that was quite helpful on the story, because you're seeing how people react to them. So it wasn't necessarily just technical, like Steve, one of the guys who read it, who's a horror fan as well, he just did the whole another kill would be good. Just one more, like when I'm reading it. So you get that kind of feedback. But then there was also this debate, because he's a parent that, it's a ghost horror dealing with families. He's like, man, some of this stuff's really, really intense. So it gave us that perspective, but I was like, great, that's what we want. And then we wrote another draft, and then we sent it to some screenplay competitions, and we got some feedback notes from that. So it did quite well at final draft. It was a semi-finalist in final draft. We got some screenplay from them. And then Animal Logic was running, I've had a total mental blank on their sub company's name, but Animal Logic ran a screenplay competition, and we submitted for that. And they picked the final 3, and we were in that, and there was sort of one was going to be the winner, and then the other 2 were equal seconds. So we just got pipped at the post, and we got notes on that from Stuart Beattie, who's an Australian writer, but he's, really well known for Pirates of the Caribbean, and whatever that Tom Cruise film is where he's the hitman. I've had a mental blank.
Oh, Collateral Damage, is that
Yeah,
it?
Collateral. Yeah, so he's an Australian-based writer working over there. So he gave us about 14 pages of script notes, and it's always interesting, really, receiving notes on, like any of them. Some of them you agree with, some of them you disagree with, and but it's always very, it's helpful or creatively stimulating to at least get that perspective. So. Yeah.
And how do you approach screenplay structure? There's the very sort of template, the Sid Field, the Blake Snyder schools that have very clear, paradigms and templates to follow. Some people are a little more intuitive on their structure. Where do you fall on sort of the structure debate?
Yeah, it's always an interesting one. I mean, I like a well-structured film, and it's when we're developing this, I mean, we've already watched a lot of horror, but we're really just studying the genre. I'm really big on, my film students, I teach them as well about really study that genre that you're writing in. So it really more became about what's the stuff that is expected in that genre and how do you do it in an original way. But I do like that, the structural approach. I mean, I don't like that really prescriptive, this has to happen exactly here and by this point or this page, because if I take my top 10 favorite films, they wouldn't hit all those beats, but it still is very considered on, what's your inciting incident, what's your first act turn. I wanted a fairly tight first act on the film anyway, just to get in and moving with the story. I mean, from a directing point of view, I certainly, knowing what the structure is makes life a lot a lot easier from a directing point of view. But I mean, I've read all of the books with Sid Field, Robert McKee's story, even, Save the Cat. So, I just, for us all, it's really about story, so from a writing point of view, and I know that's why Beth likes working with, because even as a director, everything I've directed, it's always about story. And the structure certainly helps. Yeah.
So then talk about, okay, so you guys had a script, you'd gotten some notes from people, you polished it up, you're happy with your script. What were those next steps to actually getting this thing produced? How did you raise the money? How did you put this project together?
After that, that was 2016, we started writing, and that was about 2 years, that process. And then 2018, I was like, this is the year we're going to make it happen. And I just started off by, I met with a bunch of people in Melbourne who've made films in this way, just for their advice, so different, writer directors or producers, and just want to go about, how did you go about making your film? And one of those meetings was one of those by chance. The composer on the film, Mark Byes, had said, he was teaching a course. He said, a student of mine, her husband's produced some horror films in Indonesia, even though they're Melbourne based, and Indonesia's got a really thriving horror community. So he said, I said, could you organize a coffee meeting with him for me? And he lined that up, and I thought, I'd gone in there just for advice, and it turned out that he was an executive producer who'd financed these films. And it was one of those I hadn't gone into pitch, but then he said, what's yours about? And I ran the pitch by him, and he said, it sounds really interesting. Can you send me the screenplay? So I sent him the screenplay, and then he sent me a message that night saying, let's meet up again next week. And he's really taken by the story. He's a really big fan of Ring and Grudge as well, which were influences on Surrogate. And so he ended up being, one of the financier on the film. But I'd met with a bunch of other, producers and people beforehand. So we'd had that false start where we had a producer who was on board, and then they pulled out, or they ghosted us, no pun intended. And so it was really about meeting a lot of those people like that until you get those people who can, jump on board and get interested in the project.
I'm curious, an actress like Jane Badler, bringing her onto the project, at what point did she come on? Did you have the money raised, or did you get her assigned, and did that help you get the money? I'm always sort of curious how filmmakers actually work those, because it always seems like the common, frankly, a misconception that, if you just get your name actor, the money's going to come rolling in. And it usually doesn't work that way either. It's not as easy as that. that. But how did this go down for you? How did you get Jane? And then ultimately, did that affect raising the money or not?
Yeah. So, yeah, Jane getting on board, it didn't actually, we'd already had it financed at that stage. And again, it was just, I guess my overall thing is how you get a film made is it's lots of work, lots of meetings, and you're just pushing and pushing and pushing until you find all of those elements that will put the puzzle together for you. So I really, when I said it was the start of 2018, we didn't start shooting the film till 2020. So it was nearly 2 years of meeting people to that finance and get them involved. And how Jane got involved is so Comfer, who was the executive producer, he was already on board with the film, and we were starting to cast that film. And he's on we got the Victorian College of the Arts, so it's the local main art school in Melbourne, and he's on the creative board of that through the philanthropic arm. And Jane Badler is actually, she's been living in Melbourne for, I think, 20 odd years. So she was also on the same board meeting, and he actually said, "Oh, look, I'm executive producer on this horror film. Do you want to read the screenplay?" And she said, "Yeah." And it was one of those things. She read it, and then I met her for coffee. Thought she'd be really good for the role. It was one of the few people I didn't audition for the role. I just gave it to her. And so she came on board that way. So it was after the fact. It didn't affect the finance, but sorry, it wasn't that mechanism to get people on board.
Yeah. So
we'd already had Kirsty Marassi, who played the lead on it, and so she obviously knew her from Wolf Creek, and she knew that I wanted to get a really good cast together for the film, and that appealed to her as well. So it was one of those really kind of coincidental meetings. Yeah, if Comfer's not at that meeting, he doesn't bump into her.
But it sounds like you're very good at networking, because there's a number of sort of stories you've now told us where it sort of was this networking, like the guy that financed it. You've made a lot of connections through your teaching and just film in general. You just seem to be putting yourself out there, and then, you're friendly, and eventually some of these things actually work out.
Yeah. I mean, networking is that biggest part, and because you don't know what's going to come from where. That's my attitude. And like I said, I had a lot of coffee meetings, and I go to these meetings to ask for people's advice. And I think that's one of the things I learned most from my early meetings with people weren't, I need to get this from you, or can you play this function? It's really just like, what's the best way to go about this? And it helped that the screenplay, people were reacting really strongly to it. And I think that was the other big calling card, that people reading this screenplay and they want to be involved in the film. And as I always say, it's like, you can either get, you've got great money or a great project, and it's ideal if you get both, but it's very rare. You either go great money or great project. Putting those two things together, I'm sure, if you get $30 million doing the 10th Marvel film you've been in, that's great money, but maybe you're not satisfied. And so what we had to offer was really great screenplay. And, Jane's character in the film, is a really interesting function it plays in the story, and a lot of depth with her character. And the same with a lot of, the actors. When I'm back on that writing part, I always kind of thinking about, not just how the character works in the story, but what will it give the actor to be able to do? Like, why will someone want to play this role? And so each character, we try and give them something in there, rather than just a pure function. And
as an example, like, what did you give Jane's character? What was it, that kernel that you thought an actor would kind of gravitate towards?
Well, there's a couple of things. So an early scene in the screenplay, and this is an example of mine and Beth's collaboration with writing, is when she's working as in child protection services, and there's a scene when she's in a hospital, and they've got to find out what's going on with this child. And Beth had written the scene, and it was well written, but it kind of gave away the game a little bit early. And when I watch, crime films and TV, I hate the interrogation when they kind of walk in straight away and slap the knife down on them and go, "We know you did it." And I wrote the scene. It's like, just going to ask these general questions like I'm friendly, and try and get you to, first of all, like, give yourself up, but confused. So it's in the person's being interrogated, confused as to what's this actually about. Because if you straight away go, I know you did it, then if they did it, they can go, no, I didn't. Or they can start conjuring lies. So this scene, was appealing because you play it out in a way that it's like, you think I'm approaching you this way, and you don't even know I'm interrogating you yet. And then it turns out she has a very strong agenda for why she's there to talk to this person. The other part also is that she's sort of a secondary antagonist in the story. You know, and horror films work best when you've got a grounded antagonist as well. Like, have you seen Alien, the original, obviously?
Yeah.
You know, it's like you got the alien monster, but then you've also got the android. So you've got that more grounded reality horror that's not an immediate, obvious horror. And so Jane plays that a little bit in the story, where she's an antagonist to the protagonist. And what I said to her, though, I didn't say exactly, you know, the audience is going to see you as the baddie, but I just said, you can't see yourself as that. You're there for pure, noble motives. You're here to protect children. And I think, you know, actors like playing scenes, you know, in that regard, where it's like, you know, I'm here for a really good reason. The audience might not think that.
Yeah, for sure. So interesting. So how can people see Surrogate? Do you know what the release schedule is going to be like?
Yes. So it'll be out on Amazon Prime on the 2nd, which is this Friday in America, I believe. It'll be Saturday in Australia. And then on the 16th of September on Tubi TV. Okay. And Google.
Perfect.
And then over the next couple of months, it'll roll out. But if people wanted more information, the website we've got is surrogatefilm.com.
Okay. And perfect. And my last question is always, what's the best way for people to keep up with what you're doing? And if you have a URL or Twitter for the movie, you can mention that now, but your own personal one as well. And I round all this stuff up, and I'll put it in the show notes so people can click over there. But it sounds like, so you have maybe Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook as well.
Yes. So the website is surrogatefilm.com, and that will have the links to Instagram and Facebook. And also my writer director one is David Willing, writer director. So that will have links to all of these productions. And on the Surrogate website, for people who are interested, if you put your email address, we don't spam you, but we just send a notification out when it's going to be available on a streaming service. So people can find us through there.
Perfect. Well, David, I really appreciate you coming on and talking with me today. Good luck with this film, and good luck with all of your future films as well.
Thank you very much for having me on. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you. We'll talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.
A quick plug for the SYS Screenwriting Analysis Service. It's a really economical way to get a high-quality professional evaluation on your screenplay. When you buy our 3-pack, you get evaluations at just $67 per script for feature films and just $55 for teleplays. All the readers have professional experience reading for studios, production companies, contests, and agencies. You can read a short bio on each reader on our website, and you can pick the reader who you think is the best fit for your script. Turnaround time is usually just a few days, but rarely more than a week. The readers will evaluate your script on 6 key factors: concept, character, structure, marketability, tone, and overall craft, which includes formatting, spelling, and grammar. Every script will get a grade of pass, consider, or recommend, which should help you roughly understand where your script might rank if you were to submit it to a production company or agency. We can provide an analysis on features or television scripts. We also do proofreading without any analysis. We will also look at a treatment or outline and give you the same analysis on it. So if you're looking to vet some of your project ideas, this is a great way to do it. We will also write your logline and synopsis for you. You can add this logline and synopsis writing service to an analysis, or you can simply purchase this service as a standalone product. As a bonus, if your screenplay gets a recommend or a consider from one of our readers, you get to list the screenplay in the SYS Select database, which is a database for producers to find screenplays and a big part of our SYS Select program. Producers are in the database searching for material on a daily basis, so it's another great way to get your material in front of them. As a further bonus, if your script gets a recommend from one of our readers, your screenplay will get included in our monthly Best of newsletter. Each month we send out a newsletter that highlights the best screenplays that have come through our script analysis service. This is monthly newsletter that goes out to our list of over 400 producers who are actively looking for material. So again, this is another great way to get your material out there. So if you want a professional evaluation of your screenplay at a very reasonable price, check out www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/consultants. Again, that's sellingyourscreenplay.com/consultants. On the next episode of the podcast, I'm going to be interviewing Daniel Dignan and Josh Stifler, who just did a horror film called Greywood's Plot. It's another great example of two guys just getting out there and making things happen for themselves. Daniel and Josh wore many hats on this film. They wrote it together. Josh directed it and actually starred in it as well. Daniel was one of the leads. So really, it's just two guys just getting together and really making something happen for themselves. They did it all far from Hollywood. So keep an eye out for that episode next week. That's the show. Thank you for listening.